Thank you. And let's just check that you can all hear me. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. This is one of my favourite things to do, is to talk with people about theories of change and how we can use those. Okay, so in terms of hearing me, I've got 2 yeses and a cannot hear, so it suggests that some people might be having some local problems. And sometimes there's different audio settings for that, so I hope you can change that. In addition to this webinar, there's a number of ways to engage with these ideas. There is a brief that we worked on with a lot of feedback from people within UNICEF around not just theories of change in general, but what does this mean for impact evaluation of UNICEF programs, projects, and not just sort of service delivery projects, but also the sort of upstream policy development work, the really complicated and complex programs that UNICEF is often involved in. So we had terrific feedback around that, and we have really drawn on a number of examples, some of which we'll discuss a little bit today. So that's certainly a resource to follow up, and it's one in a series of briefs that talk about different aspects of impact evaluation. The other issue, the other way to be engaged in this is to provide some questions or comments. So as I'm going through, I'd really encourage you, as a question comes up, to use the chat window to put in that question. I've tried to keep the presentation pretty short, really focused on a few key ideas, and give us a real chance to engage around those questions. So please put those up as they come to you, because yesterday we had a great flood of questions sort of right at the end. People started typing at the end, and we had less time to go through those. But before we start hearing from me, I really wanted to get a bit of a feel of where you're coming from. So we're going to do a poll. So I'd like you to each individually just say which of these best matches you, the experience you've had using a theory of change for monitoring and evaluation. Now, I know that UNICEF uses theories of change a great deal for planning purposes, and obviously it's got a lot of utility around that. This poll is really about using it for monitoring and evaluation. So answer 1 if you've had no experience. 2, if you were involved in a program or project where there was an existing theory of change but it wasn't really used much for monitoring or evaluation. 3, if you've helped to develop a theory of change. 4, if you've used an existing theory of change to guide the monitoring and evaluation. And 5, if you've been involved in developing it and using it for monitoring and or evaluation. So just think about which of that is. Now, you don't need to type this in. Nicola's going to show you how you can actually interact with the screen. So Nicola, do you want to take over now? Okay,
everyone, so I have created the poll. I hope you can see it on your screen. And if you could just vote by clicking to the left as to which one applies to you, to give us an idea of what you have been involved in. So I can see that some of you are voting. Some of you are typing it in the instant messaging window. It'd be better if you actually clicked on the poll so that we can get an aggregate there. So it's looking good. So far 16 people have voted. There are 41 of you, so if more of you could vote, that would be great. Okay, so far we've got 25 responses. 52% of people say that they have helped to develop a theory of change for a project or a program. The next most frequent response is I have been involved in a project or program where there was an existing theory of change but was not really used much for monitoring or evaluation. So that's 33%. 11% say I've helped develop a theory of change and used it for monitoring or evaluation. and 7 say I've used an existing theory of change to guide monitoring and evaluation. So by far, the most of our attendees out of the 27 that voted today, Patricia, have helped to develop a theory of change for a project or program, but it looks like not so much in monitoring and evaluation itself. So I'm going to stop presenting now and hand over to you again. Thank you. Thanks everyone for voting.
Thank you. So that's very interesting in terms of the elements that we're going to look at today, which is both about how do you develop it, but also how do you use it for monitoring and evaluation. I'll just get this the presentation up again.
Just confirming we can see it. We are on slide 4. Thank you.
It's working. Excellent. Terrific. And Nicola, while I just get starting, if there's a couple of people still having trouble with audio, perhaps you might just give them a message in that about some things they might try. That would be really helpful. So this webinar really is for people who have this range of experience. So for some of you, most of you have had some experience of seeing it, of what we mean by a theory of change, and some of you, many of you have been involved in developing it, and some of you have actually been using it for M&E. And if you're in that situation, we'd be really interested to, hear from you about other examples or other issues and other examples that people might particularly like to look at. So in terms of the webinar, the points I'd like to go through with you, it's just being really clear what we mean by a theory of change. It's one of these terms that gets used in quite different ways, and I think it'd be helpful to have a common understanding around that and to be aware of the different ways some people use it. Look at some of the ways of developing a theory of change. There's more to it than just getting a bunch of post-it notes and producing it. Some different ways of representing a theory of change and why that's important and why you should really think about that and not just think it's about a very set format that you might use. And then actually, how do we use that in an impact evaluation? Not for planning purposes, but to help inform our impact evaluation design and implementation. So some different ways of doing that. And I really hope to leave a good chunk of time for us to explore both questions you have, comments. You might disagree with some of the suggestions I'm making, and I'd be really interested to hear that. You might be interested in where you can find more information. You might have some other examples to point us to. So let's start by what we mean by a theory of change. And at the essence, it's about the links between what we do and what we're hoping to achieve. Usually we spread that out a little bit and actually show what are the bits in between. We actually identify what's a chain of results between what we do and what we hope to achieve. But it's not always this very simple linear way of looking at it, and it's not always that they have all these activities up the front. So let's look at some of the variations in that. One of the big differences, I think, in terms of this, in terms of actually making it a theory of change, is to actually have a theory about how change is about. You know, all those little arrows in between? We actually need to have some narrative about how it happens. So we might, the example that's in the brief is actually from an evaluation of female genital mutilation cutting. So it's a really big area of programming. It's got a lot of complicated interactions into how it works, and we'll revisit that in a moment. But the bit that I think was really helpful as an example was that part of this was looking at meetings of community members. And in a good theory of change, you wouldn't just show these are the results, but how does a community meeting work? Because then that tells you something about what would be a good community meeting. It can actually help you to develop much better data collection strategies to look at that. So if you think about the community meeting, is it about actually providing new information to them, actually filling in gaps? Was it about not about, say, risks of that, but actually information about incidents so that you're changing norms. Is it about helping them to create opportunities to create new ceremonies to celebrate adulthood, so a way of overcoming the barriers? So, what is it that you're actually doing here? Is it about forming some social capital so that they can actually support each other around certain decisions? Is it about trying to influence actual individual families or opinion leaders or gatekeepers or formal representatives? So really thinking about how does this work is important. Now, this is something that's missing from a lot of theories of change, and if you read really earlier books on it, they all talked about this, but it's the one bit that people often just forget. They just leave this out. They just say, oh, we do this stuff and this other stuff happens, and they draw a little arrow in between, but they don't actually say how is it that it happens. And I was one of the people who was guilty of this. I used theories of change for many years, both in local government, federal government, NGOs, and you can get a long way without asking this question, but it keeps bumping up against that limitation. And it was when I was working with a colleague, Sue Fennell, to actually write about program theory, a book on program theory, and she was really insistent about how important this was. And I started being explicit about this in my work and just found the huge difference it made in my work. To be really explicit about how change comes about. So it's something that I'd really encourage you to think about, that a theory of change has actually got to talk about how change comes about. The other way in which theories of change often need to go beyond that simple version is that we don't just talk about what we do, but also what others do. And this is something really relevant for UNICEF, because UNICEF, from what I've looked at, almost never goes out and does things by itself. It's often working with national governments or subnational governments. It's often working with other UN agencies. It's often working with NGOs. And showing just what UNICEF does is actually missing the map of what's actually going on and what you're trying on. So it's really important to be able to show what others do. Now, sometimes you can just show it like that there's complementary activities going on. Other times, the activities are not all up the front, right? A lot of the programs are not like a set of dominoes where you tilt something at the front and then all the rest of the outcomes happen. But in fact, you're saying, well, there's a chain of results, and we do things all along that causal chain, and so do others. And so you can start to identify what they're doing in your diagram, and then your evaluation can start to say, well, did they actually do it? Did we actually do our part? Did we achieve that intermediate outcome? And you can start to identify where that chain is breaking down. The other way that a theory of change can be elaborated is not just to look at what we hope to achieve, but actually to identify potential other impacts. And this can be particularly important when there are potential negative impacts. And we'll look at an example later on that did exactly this. Now, the OECD DAC definition of impacts is not just did you achieve your objectives. It talks about intended and unintended, positive and negative. And they're really ethical reasons why we need to include negative outcomes if they're significant. So you can represent that in a logic model as well. So if you think about all of those, this very simple linear version of a logic model, where you have inputs are used for activities, which produce outputs, which lead to outcomes, which lead to impact, doesn't pick up all of these issues. It doesn't pick up activities all the way along the chain. It doesn't pick up unintended impacts. It doesn't pick up the activities of other organisations, and it doesn't show any of the other factors that can affect it, either enablers or barriers. And so, although this version here is a very common version, it's often not so useful. And in fact, most of the versions that look like this don't actually have a theory of change, even though they're labelled that. They don't actually say, how does this change come about? So if you have any comments on that, you might like to put those in the window now. You might have a different view on that, or have some questions about that. I want to go on to the second topic, really, which is, okay, so if the theory of change has to try to explain two things: how does change come about, and how do our activities trigger that? All right, so you might say the change will come about through increased knowledge. Well, how will we get the increased knowledge? Will we have a meeting? Will we write a book? Will we do a webinar? Right, so you have two levels of it. How does change come about, and what is it that we do to bring about that change? And you can do that at each level, at each step in the chain. The next thing is, well, how do you develop that theory of change? And this might be at the start of the program when you're actually doing the planning, or it might be when you're doing the impact evaluation and you want to revisit it. And so you need to do a number of things. One, you need to do your situation analysis of what are the problems or the needs that the program is meant to address. What are the causes of those? Should the program be looking at the symptoms, or going back and looking at the root causes and trying to address those? What are the consequences of these problems, and should the program be directly addressing the consequences as well? And also, not just a deficit approach. What are the strengths and opportunities? Who are the other players in this that you might be able to work with? What sort of leverage can you get? And then starting to set some boundaries around it. You know, we often have a really large challenge, or that large need. What are the aspects that we're going to be able to do for this program? What do we actually expect to be able to achieve in terms of shorter term and longer term results? And then you start to develop a theory of how you'll achieve those. And at those two levels, what is the change? How will that change come about? And what will we do to trigger that change process? So where do you get that theory from? Well, you should really get it from a number of sources. The needs assessment might well have some data about what causes those problems, and it might then identify what can be done to interrupt that problem chain. If you're starting the evaluation, the program should have some documented objectives, and it might have some clear strategies about how to achieve those. We should be drawing on previous research and evaluation, both research on practice and theories, theoretical approaches. So deterrence, for example, is a theory about how you bring about behaviour change, and it's got these aspects that people need to fear being detected and fear the consequences of being detected. And you have to have both of those in place in order for deterrence to work. So there's an example where you take a research-based theory, you identify the elements, and then you'd say, okay, what are the activities we're implementing so people are fearful that they will be detected, and what's in place so that they fear the consequences of being detected? And are we achieving those? Another source is to look at expert opinion. Those experts might be researchers, they might be practitioners, they might be community members, they might be any sort of key informant who can say to you, how does that actually happen, that change comes about? And the other thing we can do is to work with stakeholders, all sorts of stakeholders and participants, about their mental models. How do they think about that? So, for example, in one evaluation I was involved with, it was a community development program, and I went around and talked to some really experienced managers, and what became clear was that many of them had a strategy about low-hanging fruit, that if they were going to engage with the community, they would try to get some early wins to demonstrate to the community that they were worth them engaging with, that they were actually going to not just talk, but that they would get some things done. And that hadn't been articulated in any of the documentation, but it was a really important strategy. It's one that's quite well based, and it had real implications for their choice of what they would choose to get involved in. Now, it's still just a theory. You could actually test that out and see, are you better off not going for early wins, but really focusing on a few long-term successes, right? But there was a mental model in there about early wins. And how I got to that was not by looking at the documentation, but by talking to people. And really not asking them what their mental model was, but just going as a person to say, tell me how you think this works. What makes it work? What are you trying to achieve here? we can draw on these research-based theories, and in the brief we've actually got some examples here. This is some really nice work that's been done by Church and Rogers, the different Rogers, that's looking at some different theories about conflict transformation programs. And you can see that they're really quite different. I hope you can see that still on the screen. Depends a bit how big your screen is. But the point here is that some of them work by working with individuals, and some of them start by working with actually the root causes to reduce, both oppression and exploitation, and other ones actually start to strengthen the institutions so that they can better manage and prevent the conflict. So there's quite different strategies about what you do. And you might, in a single program, have a number of these theories. You might have a number of elements in your program. And many of the programs that are most successful have a number of different theories going on about change, and they're complementary. So again, these really simplistic logic models often don't get into this. And they're not then good for communicating. They're not good for really helping you to understand, why it worked here or why it didn't. We'll talk a little bit more soon about how you use it. The third section is, how do you represent it? And I just wanted to share some of the examples that that have been used for UNICEF evaluations. And they really show, I think, some good practice, which is about saying, use the format that helps to communicate the particular aspect. So let's look at a couple of these. This is a really simplified version. This is in the program around female genital mutilation and cutting, and it's not trying to say how all the different bits fit together. It's trying to communicate a couple of key messages. So here at the bottom you've got a whole set of interventions. It's not specifying them. It's trying to talk about programming generally, so that these interventions will vary in different situations. The first level is talking about 4 different areas of work. One is about changing access to services, like improving that. One is about the changes in the legal and policy frameworks. One is looking at both collective and individual knowledge and attitudes, and then changes in public discourse. And what it says is all of those need to be being worked on in order to achieve the changes in the social norms. That it's the changes in the social norms that's critical in then having changes in the collective and individual behaviours that will reduce prevalence. So what this diagram does is that it has a really clear message that it's about social norms. So some programs have a very weak degree of change. They'll say, well, we'll run an information session, people will have improved knowledge and you will have change of behaviours. But in many situations, the norms will be such an influence on behaviour that unless they change, knowledge by itself won't be enough. So that communicates that. It also identifies where there are really major data gaps, and that can help you in your impact evaluation to say, well, our monitoring data, for example, has some of the lower level data. Maybe your social indicators, your social statistics, your health statistics have good data, hopefully, about prevalence. The data gap is actually in that middle. It's around the link between norms and individual behaviours. So that's what this diagram is trying to do. At the other extreme, you have this diagram from the evaluation of the Child Support Grant in South Africa, and it has a lot of detail about the different components in this, and there's it's one you can certainly look at in more detail at another stage. There's just a couple of things I wanted to point out about it. You'll see down the right-hand side, it's sort of mapped onto the linear logic model about activities and outputs, and then short-term, medium-term and long-term outcomes, so it's over time. But it actually, by having these different columns, you can see how different bits relate to there's sort of different strands of the causal model. And some people call these like swim lanes, that different activities will actually contribute to a whole chain of results. What's particularly interesting in this one is that they don't just have positive results. You would hope that the child support grant means that there's more resources available for the children, that they get better nutrition, they get better access to school, and you get a whole range of better health and well-being outcomes. But there's also a risk in that if that additional money is not used for the children, that it might be used for other purposes. It might lead to more risky behaviour and in fact have some unintended and negative social impacts. So clearly they had either research evidence or anecdotes about that or concerns, and it was really important for the evaluation to address those. So by putting them on the logic model, you can say we'll also check for these unintended impacts, given that there's concern about them. And the diagram also shows some of the factors that influence the achievement of the results. So it's really possible to show a whole chain of results, to show how they interlink, to put on negative impacts, and to show the other factors. So you can see there's a whole variety of them, and ideally you use a format that's going to communicate what you really need. More and more I'm thinking that we shouldn't just have one way of representing it, we should have variety. And even for one program you might use a range of diagrams. You might have an overview that you use for funders to say here are the high level, here's a high level image of it and a high level explanation, but for the people actually involved and for the people developing the evaluation, you might have a really detailed one. So when I'm working with people, and I do a lot of work around program theory and theories of change, I sort of zoom in and zoom out so that I'll get a lot of detail about what the causal chain is, and this leads to that, this helps to bring about that, and then I'll start to try to chunk it to say, okay, there's a group here that's around deterrence, there's a group here around capacity building, there's a group here around increasing access to services, and so you actually can have a detailed version and then a really chunked version. And the fourth area I want to talk about is actually about using it for impact evaluation. And in the brief, we talk about some different ways of using it. So one is that by laying out the theory of change, you might say, look, some of these links are pretty well established. The link between smoking and lung cancer, for example, is very well established. You don't need to keep reproving that in every evaluation. And the same in UNICEF's work. Some of the work that you do is based on really years of research and evaluation, and you don't need to go keep testing every link, but you might identify particular links that you really do want to test and that will lead to specific evaluation questions. Second way is that you can identify particular variables that you should include. So now you've identified what the links are, you can identify the variables you need to collect. You can map over it, where do we have existing data and where will we need to collect some more. So it can really help you to prioritise that. In many cases, the impacts we're interested in are not going to occur during the life of the evaluation. So what it can help you to do is to identify these intermediate outcomes that you can collect data about. And that should be indicators that you're at least on track to achieve the impacts. It can help you to identify the aspects of implementation that should be examined. So if you've talked about a community meeting, a meeting of community members, and said, actually, this is going to work through having social capital, so people have some trust, and then they can start to talk about social norms. You'll say, well, what are we doing to help build social capital? Are we having small groups where people feel safe and can trust each other? Are we going to have some safe self-disclosure? What is it that we're going to do to build social capital? And you can start to identify what would be a good community meeting. So it can actually help you to identify what would be quality implementation. So in this case, you might say, we really need to have someone facilitating the meeting who is known and trusted. And so then you can actually look at whether that's been achieved. And the other way that you can use a theory of change for impact evaluation is to identify the contextual factors and start to look for patterns across sites and across cases. So let's look at a couple of those examples. This is a schematic depiction of the theory of change. This is looking at a peer review group meeting, but this could be mapped over any of them. So here, instead of labelling what that mechanism is, it's talking about this in terms of assumptions and risks. So that you might say, we think that these outputs will lead to this outcome, but the assumption is that it's within this particular context that it will do that. If we plant a seed, we'll get the crop to come up, but only if we get sufficient rain. The assumption is we will get sufficient rain. Well, you can go and test that assumption. The assumption is that if we have this community meeting, people will feel free to discuss that, but that's only if there's not been pre-existing distrust in the community. Well, we can check that assumption. So it's not, the assumptions are not just about putting them in your diagram, it's then saying, well, how can you check them out? And how can you test your bigger assumption that if all these things are in place, you're going to get the results you need? If you are finding problems in terms of trust, you would expect that you wouldn't get success in those communities. So you can start to look for patterns across your data. And this also talks about identifying indicators at each level. And that helps you then guide your data collection or your data retrieval. This example actually has, again, a very detailed theory of change about what the different elements are, and it starts to map onto that. Where do we have existing data that will be good enough, and where should we focus our data collection efforts? And I think this is a really helpful way to use your theory of change, and to really plan your evaluation, to identify what we already have. Is it good quality data? Will it be good enough? Or will we actually have to go and collect that again because we can't really trust the data? And this comes up, we know, in many of the contexts that there's not good quality data. Sometimes the monitoring data is not very good. Sometimes the social indicator data is not very good. But where should we focus our efforts? I want to talk about this particular example in a little bit more detail. This is such a great example about using a theory of change to identify where does the causal chain break down. And the working paper that we've referenced there is a really nice example that takes you through it in much more detail. It refers to an integrated nutrition program in Bangladesh, which had a theory that you would identify the children that were undernourished by identifying those that were small for age and were light for height. And that you would then target those, you would actually provide supplemental feeding for them, you would educate the mothers who would then change their feeding practices, and you would then improve the nutrition of these children and have a whole lot of very good results for them. We know that the research on the inadequate nutrition and child development and cognitive development and school achievement is very well established. So this stops at improved nutritional outcomes because the rest of the causal chain is pretty well established. Now, what they found in this was that they were not getting the improved nutritional outcomes. And so what this impact evaluation was not so much did it work, but why didn't it work? And when they went back and checked all of the links in the chain, what they found was that many of these links were not working the way that they thought. So this was showing that it would be possible for the health service deliverers to identify the children who should be in the program. What they found was that many of them were actually unable to correctly interpret the growth charts. So they were not picking up the children who were light for height or light for age. And so the children they were referring to the program often were not the ones who should have been in it. So it was breaking at that point. And the other really important area where it broke was that they were targeting the mothers, assuming that they would be the ones making the decisions about child feeding. And what they found was that, in fact, in most cases, they were living either with their mother or their mother-in-law, usually their mother-in-law, and they were the ones making the decisions about child feeding. and they weren't even targeting them. So there was really no point for the mother being having her opinions or her knowledge changed, because she wasn't the one making the decisions. And the final one I want to talk about in terms of using theories of change for impact evaluation is this one, which is looking at increasing access and equity in early childhood education. And what's interesting here is that this was one looking across a number of countries. So it's a generic theory of change, which talks about UNICEF and a range of other actors who take particular core roles in order to address particular determinants and then improve access. So that what they're saying here is that sometimes it's about reducing financial barriers. Sometimes it's actually about increasing the places that are available. Sometimes it's about social norms and attitudes to early childhood education. And sometimes it's about the quality of early childhood education. So it's a way of thinking, so what's the problem? And then you have a solution to address that. So the different colours here are about showing some different countries who had different pathways through this. So it's sort of like a menu, and they picked the ones that were relevant. And this is really helpful in terms of trying to do synthesis across different countries. And you can start to then cluster the different cases. These are the ones we're working on these aspects, and these ones we're working on these other aspects. So I hope I've shown some different examples that this is, way beyond just that simple linear model. And I just want to finish with a couple of suggestions at each of these that might be useful for improving the quality. So one is in terms of defining what we mean by a theory of change. Actually make sure it is a real theory of change. Make sure you can say, this is how change is going to come about, and this is what we will do to trigger that change. When you're developing it, it shouldn't just come from the documentation. It shouldn't just come from key informants. It shouldn't just come from people with post-it notes. Really draw on a range of those sources to develop it, and including research, and get some experts to review it and say how plausible is this, how feasible is it. When you're representing it, don't think you have to be confined to use a log frame or a sort of results chain. Think about what the messages are, who this is for, and how you might represent that. And then when you're going to use it to guide your data collection, use it to guide your analysis, right, to look for particular patterns, to look for exceptions, and use it in your reporting. Because what people understand are narratives, and you can tell a story about how it works and when it doesn't work. So it really helps you to get beyond just looking at the average effect and saying it does work. And you can start to say it worked in situations where we were doing these activities well and then achieving this particular outcome. So I'm going to stop at that point and start picking up some questions. And Nicola, I'll ask you to help orient me to some questions. I really look forward to it. Yes.